Okay, dokie. All right, well, welcome to our next webinar. My name is David. I am the committee chair for Education Committee for the Poway Adult School. January has been the month of wellness, and I think this is very appropriate for our membership as we focus on getting healthy, or staying healthy, and some of the dangers that may prevent us from doing that. That being said, I'm going to hand it over to Pierra, and she will introduce our guest today, and then we'll continue on with our presentation. So Pierra, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday to everyone. I hope everyone is well and safe. My name is Pierra.Moise, and I am your moderator for today's education webinar. Welcome to today's education webinar series, Vaping/Smoke-Free Living, How to Protect Yourself to Others. And thank you for joining us this morning. We have two amazing and inspiring guest speakers here with us this morning, and that is Dr. Crotty-Alexander and Janan Moein. Please, everyone, to refrain from background noise, please mute your phones. And if you have any questions, please feel free to type it in the chat box, and we will have a Q&A session right after today's webinar. So, Dr. Crotty-Alexander, she completed her undergraduate and medical education at Duke University prior to internal medicine residency at Massachusetts General Hospital. She is an associate professor of medicine at UCSD, where she directs the first block for the School of Medicine. She is also the new section chief of pulmonary critical care medicine at the VA San Diego healthcare system. Her research is currently funded by NIH, VA, SPARC, and the California TRDRP. And she focuses on the health effects of e-cigarettes, as well as molecular pathways in asthma and lung inflammation in general. She is known as the national vaping expert. And then also we have, and he is going to be our second guest speaker. He is one of Dr. Crotty-Alexander's patient, and he survived EVALI. He is a vaping prevention advocate for the community. And Janan also was featured on the New York Times newspaper. And the article is about him and the connection of COVID-19 and vaping. So without further ado, Dr. Crotty-Alexander and Janan Moein.
Thank you so much, Pierra. Always nice to get an intro by you. Always makes me feel a little bit better about myself. You really know how to sell us to the crowd. We're going to try and convey a fair amount of information about vaping. And so I'm going to talk for the first 30 minutes or so, and then we have time for Q&A, and then Janan's going to go into his story. So I hope you'll all be engaged. So just to start off, I always like to take a brief step back for anybody who doesn't understand how e-cigarettes and vaping devices work. I like this picture because it really gives some of the variation across devices. So on the far left, you'll see the more cig-alike devices that are about the size of a cigarette, and then the purple vape pen, third from the left. And the largest device is called a box mod, and that's considered a third, fourth generation device. And it can apply a much higher wattage, but it can also do temperature control. And then on the right-hand side are the newest, the latest and greatest e-devices, including the Juul, the Blue, and the Sorens. And I'll show you a picture of the puff bars in a second. So although they look very different, they can be very different sizes, colors, shapes, they all have some components that are the same. So on the far right-hand side here, you see the battery that is typically a lithium-ion rechargeable battery. And then on the left-hand side, there's a tank or cartridge, and that's where the liquid is contained. So it's referred to as e-liquid or e-juice, electronic liquid, but it's really just chemicals, so a solution that typically contains nicotine. So when the device is activated, and it can be a push button activation, or it can be activated by actually drawing in a breath through the device, so this sort of negative flow activation, that activation activates the battery to heat this coil, so this heating element, which is in the liquid. And so it heats the liquid and then pulls it through a fine mesh to turn it into this aerosol, so this mix of very tiny droplets of these liquids that can be inhaled. So there is a lot of talk about what is in the e-liquid. So I love to ask people, what do they think is in these e-cigarettes? But the main three components in red are nicotine, propylene glycol, and glycerol. So nicotine was the reason that these devices came to be. So the modern version was invented in 2003 by a pharmacist in China because he wanted a better nicotine replacement device to help people quit smoking. And so the whole goal of this device was to be a drug delivery device. So nicotine is not very water soluble, so it's very hard to get it into a liquid solution. But propylene glycol, almost anything will dissolve in. So as a pharmacist, he knew this, and most scientists use propylene glycol to get things into solution as well. So we use it a lot in the lab for other things. But that's why the liquid contains nicotine and propylene glycol in particular. Glycerol is a thickener, so it's a thicker kind of type of propylene glycol, and it can also make the clouds look more dense and obvious. I put THC on the right there in green because now we have the dabbing devices, the marijuana vapes, and that's, they're really considered very different from the vaping devices, yet they have a lot of similarities. So I just wanted to mention that up front. One of the big drivers of use of these devices is the appealing flavors. So there's thousands of different flavors, and if you buy chocolate flavor from one company versus another, and you look at the chemical profile, they are not the same. So I bring this up because as a researcher, it's been very hard to look at the health effects of these liquids because each liquid is different than the others, primarily because of the flavorants being added. So Cool Mint has been a popular flavor across pod devices. In the middle of the screen, you see the puff bar, and that's one of the favorite devices, especially among youth and young adults. It's very similar in appearance to the Juul device as well. I get asked a lot about the role of e-cigarettes in smoking cessation, so I just wanted to bring that up. So as I mentioned, when this device was created in 2003, it was intended to be for smoking cessation. Unfortunately, the early versions of the e-cigarettes were not very good at delivering nicotine at a dose that smokers found to quench their addiction. And so the early studies of e-cigarettes as a role in smoking cessation were very negative. More recently, and by recent, I mean studies after 2016 with more modern devices that had higher wattage and were able to deliver higher levels of nicotine to the bloodstream rapidly, they've really come across to be about equivalent to other nicotine delivery devices. So now when I talk about these e-cigarettes as smoking cessation tools, it's really that, well, if they're the same as a nicotine patch or nicotine gum or nicotine spray, why would you use an e-cigarette that also delivers 50 to 100 chemicals to your lungs when you can take a more pure form of nicotine that has been studied and is safer? So that's my update on smoking cessation. And when we bring this up, it really brings up the core issue as to why we're worried about young people in particular, so kids, teenagers, young adults, picking up vaping as a habit. We worry because nicotine is one of the most addictive chemicals in the world, and it activates these pathways in the brain. And these are reward pathways. So you get a positive feeling from taking in nicotine, and that motivates you to repeat that behavior. When I looked into the most addictive substances of all time, the top three were really heroin, cocaine, and nicotine. It was really hard to find a source of data that would really confirm which one is in the lead there, but this is sort of like, a basics. I would say that the top three are pretty equivalent to one another. And I think it's a little bit easier to talk about addiction to young adults and children when you frame it in the context of media, so social media and smartphones and gaming. So, doing things like playing Minecraft, because I have an 8 and 10-year-old son, and that's all they want to do is play Minecraft. So when they play Minecraft, they get dopamine surges from killing a sheep or building a house. And then they want to repeat that activity to get another surge of dopamine. And the same thing happens when you vape. So you vape, the nicotine hits your reward pathways and you get that reward surge. And so you want to do it again. Facebook, when somebody heart or likes your comment, you get a little dopamine surge. When you check your phone and you see a text from a friend, you get a dopamine surge. So they're all the same. So they all activate the same pathway. It's just how powerful are they and how much will it make you want to repeat them? And so with nicotine, especially delivered through some of these e-devices where the nicotine content is extremely high, so they can activate this reward pathway more so than anything else you're doing in life. And so there's been some fascinating studies to look at, so say a middle schooler who used to like to play soccer with his friends, like to play with his puppy, hang out with his family, starts vaping, and the nicotine kind of hijacks that reward pathway because it releases such a large surge of dopamine that none of those other activities can reach that threshold, and thus they become less enjoyable. And so the only thing that can reach that level of reward is this vaping. So that's sort of how I've sort of framed it to high schoolers and others, just because one concept that we think might help people decide not to vape or to stop vaping is this concept of, you don't want to be addicted. You don't want to be a slave to these, substances. You want to be able to make your own choices and be an independent individual. That being said, this is a huge epidemic. So this data is from 2019 is when it was released. Unfortunately, because of the COVID pandemic and other factors, we don't have any updated data. But what I like about these is just such a clear warning sign that in the light blue bars is the use rates of e-cigarettes. So on the left is in high school students. And so you see that the rates of e-cigarettes in 2017 were about 11–12%. And then 1 year later, it was up to about 21%. And then on the right-hand side, you see that the use even in middle school students rose by 48% across that same period of time. So the e-devices are out there, they're here to stay, and kids know about them, teenagers, college students, and they're using them. And one of the reason they're using them is the addictive potential. So that once they've started using them, they're just very hard to stop. And so these were just pulled from social media of users, posting. And I really just think that they demonstrate this addictive potential, in a funny, appealing way. So I especially like the one on the right that says, what's better than your first rip off of a new Juul pod? And the response was not being addicted to nicotine. So I was like, woo! That being said, in terms of how easy is it to stop or how hard is it to stop, I've heard a lot of mixed stories, and the data out there I think is going to be different depending on the population by age and by other inhalant use. So in the college age population, so a lot of students, begin using the vapes because they're in social settings. Instead of going to a party where people are going to, pick up a beer or vodka or Jello shots or whatever, now they pass around the vapes. Now this was pre-pandemic, so let me make that very clear. So it used to be you walk into a party for the college kids and they just pass around the vapes. So maybe that's one silver lining of the pandemic, is that kids are not sharing their vapes the way that they used to. So hopefully there's a little bit less spread of respiratory pathogens from sharing of these devices. But a lot of kids would just use it in the party setting, but then they found themselves addicted. They'd buy a device. And so by the end, when they were graduating, they were using their device every day. Some kids a year or two later found it very easy to stop. They just decided they weren't going to do it and they quit cold turkey. And other ones found it very hard, and that they went through weeks of not being able to sleep and feeling jittery and anxious. So it's still, the word's out still on how to help people quit vaping. Another reason that I've felt passionately about trying to prevent students and children from picking up vaping is that it can be a gateway to conventional cigarette use. And so the data for this is actually now very strong. So, 5 years ago, we didn't really know. We're like, well, maybe, but cigarette smoking is so gross and so different than vaping. We didn't really see the younger generations doing it. But now we have like multiple big studies showing that if you look at students and young adults who have never vaped, never smoked, and then they start vaping, within a year, many more of them will have started smoking conventional tobacco versus their peers who never vaped. So in terms of disease and health effects, what diseases have been caused by vaping? So I just mentioned 5 of the big ones right here, but really every lung disease we know of has now been associated with vaping. And the reason for this is, as I mentioned, there are thousands of chemicals being used to create these liquids. And so when you inhale a set of 50 liquids, 50 chemicals, they will cause problems in your lungs. If you inhale, a different set of 50 to 100 chemicals, that will trigger something different. And so that's why we're seeing, a very broad array of lung diseases caused by vaping. So quite a few people have either developed asthma or it has exacerbated asthma, acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is also the pathologic feature of COVID-19 pneumonia, eosinophilic pneumonia, lipoid pneumonia, and hypersensitivity pneumonia are all things that we're seeing. But to center into the epidemic that happened right before the pandemic, which is just wild. So the e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury, also known as E-Valley. So just to remind you, this happened in 2019, which now seems like forever ago. There were cases of this disease in every single state in the United States, as well as some additional countries around us. The typical age of those affected was 22, but the range was 13 to 71. So it really could hit anyone, again, kind of similar to COVID. But almost 80% of those affected were under the age of 35. So it was a disease of the young. The main driver of this vaping associated disease was actually vaping of THC. So most people, or some people, call that dabbing, and they really separate it from vaping of nicotine. So this disease really made us separate it even further, because that was the major risk factor, was vaping of THC was the driver here. And doing that led to severe lung damage. And I only pop this up because, again, the pathology seen in the lungs, which is on the lower left-hand side, this is the same pathology we see in COVID-19. So in COVID-19, the virus SARS-CoV-2 gets into your lower airways and causes cell death of your epithelial cells that line the airways. And so in E-Valley, that's the same type of thing that's happening, is that it's causing toxicity to the lungs, it's killing lung cells and causing a great deal of inflammation. And now we know that vitamin E acetate is really the driver of the pathology in E-Valley. So the molecule up here on the left, you see that it's a very large molecule. This is thought to have been added to e-liquids for THC vaping because it's very thick. So on the left-hand side, if you just Google vitamin E acetate, you can come up with all these things. It's very easy to buy. And people were adding it to the THC liquids in particular. And unfortunately, now we know that it is highly toxic to the lung. So why the lung? Like, because people put vitamin E acetate on their skin. It's even like, okay to ingest it. And the same is true of many other chemicals in these e-liquids. So a lot of these chemicals are approved for ingestion. So you can eat them and they're not known to cause anything wrong. But if you inhale it, the lungs are a very different beast. And so in the upper left-hand corner, this is a microscopic image of your lung. And you see that it's designed for gas exchange. So the cells, these super thin bands, they try and be as thin as possible to allow rapid exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So that's what the lung is designed to do. Whereas the GI tract down here on the left, and same is true of the skin, is designed to have like 100 layers of cells to protect you from the outside environment. So the things coming through the GI tract, is very hard for them to cross over to the bloodstream compared to in the lungs. And the same is true for your skin. So I bring this up because a lot of people just feel comfortable vaping chemicals because they're approved for ingestion. And it's like, no. Inhaling them into your lungs is very, very different than eating them. And as I've mentioned, there's these weird parallels between COVID-19 and E-Valley. So the vaping-induced lung damage, when you compare it to the viral-induced lung damage, the patterns are very similar. And as I mentioned, one reason for that is that on the left, you have a healthy, normal lung. So on the very far left, this is a diagram of your alveoli and your lungs. And you see these happy pink cells are your epithelial cells. You have happy red cells, which are the vascular cells. And your green immune cell is roaming around the lung, sort of cleaning up things. And then on the right-hand side is when you vape a chemical that is toxic, so you've inhaled a toxic chemical, it will actually directly kill some of those epithelial and pink and vascular and red cells. And the green immune cells, realize something bad is happening and they start recruiting more immune cells to help them out. And then on the far right-hand side, you see the ARDS, the extreme lung damage that happens. So it's been interesting to be a lung doctor, seeing both of these, this epidemic and this pandemic sort of play out. But outside of these acute lung injuries that can be caused by vaping, there are also long-term health implications of vaping. And a lot of people have tried to compare them to smoking. I tend to not do that just because I feel like there are people out there who are just going to vape. That's what they're going to do. And so I want to know what vaping every day is going to do to your brain, your lungs, your heart. But there's some really nice data that compares it side by side with smoking, because sometimes that's a more powerful statement. Because if people already agree with you that smoking causes significant damage, and you can say like how similar to that vaping is, then you might be able to convince them more of, the actual pathologic effects of these inhalants. So this is a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Taryn's group out of UNC, Go Tar Heels. So, I spent 10 years at Duke, but it's, I love all the teams there. They're all really cool. So down here along the bottom panel, so you'll see non-smokers are the first column, and conventional tobacco smokers are the second, and then the e-cigarette vapors are the third. And these three measurements are all enzymes and proteases that are known to be activated in smoking-associated diseases like emphysema, and they break down the lung. So they cause damage even though they're produced by our own bodies. And so what this first one shows is that the elastase levels in the lung are the same whether you smoke or vape. And then in panel C, the metalloproteases, number 2 and number 9 are both, elevated whether you smoke or you vape. And then I like the one in the upper right-hand corner because it kind of pulls it all together. And what they did was they took samples from the airways of smokers and vapors, and they put it on gelatin, and they got to measure the total breakdowns of enzymatic activity. And you see that it's very similar whether you smoke or you vape. And then this group did a study in rats out of Colorado, and they found that whether you breathe in nicotine, e-cigarette vapor, or cigarette smoke, you have emphysema changes in the lung. So in this panel here, the normal room air rats are in the upper left, right next to the nicotine rats, and then the e-cigarette lower left and cigarette smoke lower right. And this on the right is just sort of a quantification of the emphysema changes in the lung, where the black ones, the black columns are the alveolar airspace area. So as that gets bigger, that's a sign of emphysema. And in the white columns going down, that's a decrease in capillary count, which is also lung breakdown. So these are just, a couple of the newer studies that, their findings really resonate because they did sort of compare it with cigarette smoking. There's very little data on whether vaping during pregnancy might lead to adverse effects down the line. And that's why I wanted to share this one as an example piece. And there's been a couple other studies that found similar things, that if a pregnant mom vapes, then that fundamentally alters the DNA in their children. And this is vaping while they're pregnant and breastfeeding. Not only that, but it changes the inflammatory state of the lungs in their children. So as some people have been encouraging pregnant moms who smoke to switch to vaping, it's that's not really indicated. We do not know if that is any better or any safer. So I really struggle with that when people do that. So those are some sort of lungs effects of vaping. In our lab, we expose a lot of mice to lots of different types of e-cigarette aerosols. And we found, impaired renal function. So the kidneys get hurt, the heart gets hurt. So both of them have some sort of structural changes that happen. And then recently, we just submitted this article where we exposed our mice to a couple different flavors of Juul for a short time. So like the equivalent of human use for months versus human use for a decade. And we found on the left a lot of inflammatory changes, surprisingly, in the brain. So this top arrow, all of these are changes in the brain. And then this middle arrow to the left are inflammatory changes in the heart. And then the lowest arrow is changes in the GI tract. And I mention this just because, when you vape, yes, the chemicals first hit your airways, but then they rapidly go across in your bloodstream and they hit every single organ in the body. So just how we know that smoking impacts heart function, brain function, kidneys, GI tract, the same is coming to be true of vaping. A final note is that we do a bunch of survey science and by trying to figure out what people are vaping, what they're combining it with, and how that might impact their sleep. And we have found that dual use of e-cigarettes and cigarettes, which is more common in people over the age of 25, but that's really been associated with longer sleep latency, meaning it takes you longer to fall asleep at night, and poorer sleep quality. But another interesting finding that we've seen is that if you're a dual user or even an e-cigarette user, you're much more likely to be also a user of marijuana in any form. And then on the right-hand side, this is the cocaine use, and that dual use was also associated with higher rates of cocaine use. So when we talk about gateway effects, maybe if you're a vapor, you're more likely to pick up smoking. And then once you're a vapor and a smoker, then you're more likely to be using other drugs of addiction as well. So circling back, right now, the most likely diseases that we're going to be seeing in the long run from chronic vaping are COPD, so emphysema, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma. The signal for lung cancer has been getting larger every year. We still need more data on that, but what I've seen is not encouraging. Coronary artery disease and stroke. And I like to put it in sort of a graphical form. So this is just one of the infographics that we published for the Journal of Physiology. And up top are a couple different e-cigarette devices. And then on the left are pulmonary effects, including short-term in the first box and then long-term in the lower box. And then on the right-hand side are the cardiac effects that we know so far. So short-term effects of increasing your heart rate during use, increasing your blood pressure, increasing the stiffness of your vessels, and then long-term, it's predicted that it's going to cause more vascular disease. So to conclude, it's still difficult to know what the health consequences of e-cigarettes will be, but we're seeing signals across the entire body. So these are not safe inhalants. And as we put them side by side with smoking, I've been surprised over and over at how similar they are, which still just blows my mind because the cigarette smoke has 4,000 to 7,000 chemicals and so many known carcinogens. And then the e-cigarette aerosols have like 50 to 100. But it turns out that your body doesn't really like chemicals being added to it. So I think that's why they're ending up being so similar. And nicotine itself is just really powerful. I always have to give a shout out to my lab because we have a ton of brilliant collaborators and the people who do the hard lift of doing all of these assays and studies. So they're wonderful and I love them. And then back in the pre-pandemic times, we would have lab parties at least a couple times a year. So I almost put this in this presentation just to remind me of the good times when we could hug people and not wear masks. But in any case, we'll make it through somehow. And yes, so thank you. That's my slide deck. And happy to take any questions before Janan takes it away.
I have a question. Oh, you go ahead.
Pierra, you're muted.
But Janan,
I'm sorry. Let's give Dr. Crotty-Alexander a round of applause. Thank you so much, Dr. Crotty-Alexander, for informing us on some really informative information about vaping and smoke-free living. We will do a quick Q&A session, as Dr. Crotty-Alexander just said right now. And if you guys have any questions for her, we can, get asking those questions. And also we can stand up and stretch, take a mini break from us sitting down for so long. So
one of the questions I had thrown in the
Yes.
chat box was cost. What relative to cigarettes and all the apparatuses for vaping that you showed us, what's the cost difference there that people are looking at?
yeah, and it's a little bit more complex because if you're buying one of the box mods or the vape pens, there's an upfront cost for the device and the charger and all that of about $50 to $100. It can be even greater if you're doing fancier tanks and batteries. But in the era of the pod devices and especially the puff bars, which are disposable, that they're falling like for a Juul, each pod is closer to $5 for a pod, which has been advertised as the equivalent of at least a pack of cigarettes. So, if you really focus on just the nicotine content, like once you've invested, then it probably is cheaper to be vaping. The puff bars, I should look this up, but I don't know the price of them off the top of my head. But I think each one is also considered like equivalent to a box of cigarettes.
They're like $7.99.
Okay, so really inexpensive, so cheaper than a pack of cigarettes.
On the education side, I want to also let you know that what we've seen on campuses is that the apparatuses have been disguised now into flash drives. So they look like regular computer flash drives. They even have writing on them like flash drives and things like that. So kids are walking around with them. We don't even know that they're vaping apparatuses because they are exactly like flash drives.
I'll one up you on that. So they've actually incorporated them into hoodies so that, the strings to tighten your hood, that's actually like the vape device. So it looks like you're just chewing on your hoodie string, but it's actually the vape device. So, I think people have had a lot of fun with this because they're like, okay, all we need is a lithium ion battery and we have to get the atomizer, the heating element, and the cartridge, but we can stretch it out. We can put it into all kinds of shapes and formats. And so if you Google it, there are like all kinds of crazy things to help you hide your vaping. You have to laugh, otherwise, you die. But at least they're being creative.
When I was in high school, I graduated in 2018. The kids, they don't even need those sort of very sneaky methods. They just wear a hoodie, and then they put the vape inside their hoodie sleeve, and they hit it through the sleeve, so you don't even know what they're hitting.
Wow.
And then they hit a blinker. They hold it in so long in their lungs that when it comes out, it's almost like the smoke is so minimal, even if you were looking in their direction, you might not see it. Yeah, so that's how kids do it.
Any more questions for Dr. Crotty-Alexander? And
I have
thank
a
you, David.
question.
Yes, go ahead, Amy.
So I apologize if you already covered this, but I'm wondering, how they say when you quit smoking, you can kind of reverse the effects. Do we know if that's also true with vaping?
I think it's unclear, but it's likely to be true, especially, I think, if you haven't damaged things in a permanent way. So the thing with smoking, when you have the emphysematous changes, those are irreversible. So there's no going back. So the lung function you've lost is gone. But that's usually, people who have smoked for, decades, unless unfortunately you're genetically predisposed. So we do have people who have emphysema much younger, and that's always sad. But when we talk about the immune changes and the phenotype changes and some of the cancer risk, thankfully that really does go back to zero after 15 years. And we would guess that would be the same with vaping. Because some of the changes that they're causing are so similar to smoking. So, I think I would say in general, yes. So that, if you stop vaping, your body should start returning to normal. And whether that takes months or a couple years, I think it depends on how much you did and what sort of changes were happening in your body. Because each person, responds to these chemicals a little bit differently. But I think that's a really good point, that you should be able to get back to health and, be on the straight path to living forever if you want to live forever.
Awesome, thanks.
Thank you for your question, Amy. Are there any more questions for Dr. Crotty-Alexander?
Because otherwise you're about to hear from an even more dynamic speaker.
Oh, go ahead, Janan. Did you have something?
Doctor, what was it? Ethyl acetate, is that vitamin E?
The what's the full name of it? Let me go back. There we go. No, so the vitamin E acetate, that's its real name. So there are other diacetyl and other acetates out there. So acetate is just describing one of the sort of moieties on that chemical structure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Janan, for your question, and thank you, Dr. Crotty-Alexander. So today I also have my colleague, Loralee, and she wants to provide a quick little announcement for today for us.
Just a couple of things, Loralee with the American Lung Association. Today, the Lung Association released its national report. It's called the State of Tobacco Report, and I'll put the link in the chat box. It basically looks at cities and states across the country and looks at how municipalities and territories are doing in terms of things like policies that protect people from tobacco, and it's just a very comprehensive report. So please take a look at that. I'll also put a survey link in the chat box if you don't mind. It just gets your opinions on some things going on in Poway and some of our efforts, including really important effort that we are working on to educate the public about the importance of smoke-free outdoor dining on restaurant patios in Poway. Poway is one of the few places in the county that still allows that. So I'll be putting that information. If you could take a minute to fill out that survey, that'd be appreciated. Thank you, Pierra.
You're welcome. Thank you, Loralee. So now we are going to get started, and let's welcome Janan, and he will be presenting for us. Give me 1 second. Let me know if you guys can see my screen.
Yep.
Okay. And you're up, Janan. Here you go.
Okay. Hello, my name is Janan Moein. I'm 20 years old, and I'm in college currently. I'm from San Diego, but I've lived all around the world. And this is my story when it comes to vaping and how it affected my life. Next slide. So throughout my life, I've been blessed to have a really good family and people that were always very supportive of me and gave me the best of everything. And, I had the opportunity to travel the world at a young age, which definitely enriched my perspective on things. I went to elementary school in Switzerland and the UAE, and I attended St. Augustine High School in San Diego, which is a very old and long-standing fixture of San Diego's Catholic high school. I was accepted to UCSD's Revelle College, and I was studying molecular biology. And I was always a very academic kid. In high school, I played a lot of sports. I wasn't really a vapor. However, I would say around 2017, 2018, which was my junior and senior year, I'm pretty sure at that time, in terms of at least what I observed starting in 2014, that was the year where vaping was probably the most crazy, at the height of its craziness, in terms of the fact that the majority of the kids in my grade were vaping, especially the kids that were, perceived to be cool. So I would say that was one of the heights of vaping. And at that time, I did purchase a Juul. When I was a senior, I think like early in senior year, I purchased a Juul at a place called Pacific Beach Smoke and Tobacco, which is in San Diego County. It's one of the most well-known smoke shops that is basically like known to sell to not ID people. So I basically was able to get it very easily. And I believe I paid $70. I even have the receipt. It was $70. So I paid with my debit card, and I remember when I first started vaping, even though at that time I didn't really get hooked because it was so strong, it was like, it almost made you sick. It's like nothing like you would expect. Like a cigarette, if you take like a puff of a cigarette, sometimes people might get sick, but heighten that by like, 4 or 5. So next slide. So I basically vaped on and off during that period, but in the end, I threw my vape away. Actually, I gave it to my friend because I didn't use it until I was in college, and I was 19 at the time. And when I was 19, I had some problems at home, some family drama, and I think that that's a pretty common theme among young people, is that when they have a certain problem in their life, it's easy for them to try to find some sort of vice. Now, I wouldn't say that it's like a drug, but I mean, drugs, I feel like drug is a harsh term, and I feel like it's an accusatory term. I don't like to use that because it might make teenagers feel like they're being shamed or something, like as if they're some sort of drug addict. But it's definitely a vice. I would call it a vice. So, you know, when you're in a position where you have like trouble at home, or you might not even feel accepted in school, and all the cool kids are vaping, it's like a double down effect that might coerce you into vaping. So I started vaping, and I honestly, I like to smoke weed at the time, but when I would smoke weed at home, I would smoke like a joint or something, and my parents could smell it immediately, especially because my parents don't smoke at all. And when you don't smoke, your nasal receptors, like from like 5 miles away, they could figure out what was going on. So at that point, I said, man, I need to find, especially given that I had some problems and some drama with my father, and I needed some sort of like escape. I was like, well, I need to find a way to smoke weed without them getting on my case. So the most easy option was a wax pen. I mean, there's many different terms for it. Wax pen, dab pen, you know, oil rig, but mostly wax pen. That's probably the most common term used, is wax pen. And the cartridges, they call them carts, you know. Now these cartridges range in price. I mean, they start at, you know, I think the cheapest cart you could get is about $20. I've seen some for 15, and honestly, the ones that are sold for 15 are probably like, I mean, they're like basically deadly. Like those are the ones that come from China. And even up to like $25, there's probably a lot of garbage in there. And then if you're willing to pay $30 or $40, you get a cartridge that has much more, is much cleaner. And then currently in the industry, the cleanest cartridge you can get your hands on is called Stizzy. And Stizzies are made in California. They're like $40 for a half-gram cartridge, and it's $70 for a full-gram cartridge. Now, Stizzy claims that they put the least number of additives in their cartridges, and I would say that's pretty true. Not that I only used Stizzy at that time, maybe a few times, but it was too expensive for me. So that's another thing. I feel like the vaping epidemic that there was, especially in 2019, and hopefully doesn't continue, but might continue into 2020, 2021. I think that it does affect people with lower income. Maybe not necessarily like their family makes less money, but teenagers with less income, or like less allowance, less income from a job, they're more willing to buy cartridges, whether it's nicotine or THC, that are cheaper. And usually the ones that are cheaper are typically the ones that have the most additives and are from the most obscure places like China or South America. So I do feel like, unfortunately, it is something that might, there's no studies on it, but from my experience, might disproportionately impact people of lower incomes as well. Next slide. So yeah, so in 2019, December 9th, I started feeling, I had been vaping religiously THC for about 5 months. And as I said, because of different things that were going on in my life, it kind of spiraled out of control, the level of vaping that I was doing. I mean, at first I was smoking a 1 gram cartridge in, you know, maybe 5 or 6 days. Then once, after about a month or two, one cartridge every 2 or 3 days, then 1 cartridge every 2 days. And that's something that's insane. Like, anybody that even smokes, when I tell them how much I was vaping, they're shocked. But I mean, there might be a number of factors to that. I am a pretty big guy, so maybe it took more of a substance to give me the same effect that a normal person, because I'm 230 pounds. So let's say if I was 160 or 170, maybe it would have had less of an effect on me. But I started vaping like crazy. And I remember finally I started feeling sick one day. Like, I didn't want to hit the wax pen anymore. And that was something crazy to me because I was addicted. So I was like, why would I not have this urge that I've had for months anymore? Well, it was probably because, first of all, I was extremely ill at that point and I didn't even know. And my lungs were in horrible shape, but I didn't know. And the next symptoms I started to feel, which are the most common symptoms of people with EVALI, and Dr. Crotty can confirm what I'm saying, is that I started feeling gastrointestinal symptoms like diarrhea, an urge to vomit, and lack of appetite. And overall, my sleep quality went down, which was likely because my oxygen saturation was slowly declining without me really noticing. Because you see, if you have like a sudden injury in like a car accident, you'll know right away, oh, I can't breathe. But when it's a slow decline, you might not be able to tell until you're knocking on death's door and it's like almost too late. So especially, and another thing that I want to mention, and I don't want to ramble, but I want to cover all these topics because I do feel like it makes a big difference, is that young people do think they're invincible. They have a very cavalier attitude. And unfortunately, what happened was, even when I was extremely ill and I needed medical assistance, and my parents finally caught, they didn't know I was vaping for a long time. They caught onto it. Unfortunately, they found out pretty late. They were saying, we need to go to the hospital. I was like, no, I'm fine. So that's the thing. Even when you're unfortunately, because of the lack of wisdom that young people have, often they don't know how deep of a situation they are until, my dad always says a saying. What he says is that when you're neck deep in water, you don't know you're wet. And I do think that's true. When you're this deep in water, it doesn't feel like you're wet. So essentially, my dad was, it's an interesting story. My dad was scheduled to fly to Mount Kilimanjaro, to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. And the night of, he heard me coughing in my room and playing music at like 4 a.m. And he's like, why is my son not asleep at this time? So he came into my room, and at the time, me and my dad had major drama and we were not on speaking terms. And I'm like, whoa, this is weird. Why is my dad in my room at 4 a.m.? And it was kind of awkward. He sat down, he said, why are you not asleep? And he observed my breathing and he saw that I was labored in my breathing. And I was like, Dad, I'm fine, don't worry about it. And he's like, I think I'm gonna cancel my trip because I want to take you to the hospital tomorrow. And I'm like, no, Dad, you've been planning this trip to Kilimanjaro for like 5 months. You should go. And he ended up canceling it, and that was a good thing. So we went to the hospital, and my oxygen saturation was around 60%, which is extremely low. Dr. Crotty can confirm that. That's like, it's basically like, if it was to dip below that, I could maybe become unconscious. I was very close to getting unconscious, and I was sweating profusely, and my heart rate was rising because my body was in a panic mode. My fight or flight response was very elevated. Yeah, Dr. Crotty just commented, we like oxygen saturation levels above 94%. And that's true. So 60% was really bad. So they took me to the hospital, and I was at Sharp Grossmont at first. And there, let's go next slide. And click it twice more, I think. Yeah, so they had me on an oxygen mask. And at first I was going from the least oxygen setting to, and there's like multiple masks. I don't know how many there are, but as they begin to get really bad, the masks turn black. I'm sure Dr. Crotty can confirm that. And my dad was there above me, and he's like, are you feeling fine? And I was feeling fine. And they started putting more and more oxygen. And finally, they put the black masks on, and they got to the last black mask. And my dad said, what can you do? He was telling the technician, where are the other masks? He's like, this is it. I'm almost putting pure oxygen. And he's not showing a very positive response to it. So his body's not efficient. His breathing is labored. And at that time, I also had a pneumothorax, which is it's the medical term for a collapsed lung. So my left lung had collapsed. So at that point, I had to put a chest tube in to pull the air out and to kind of seal the hole. And then I stopped responding to the 100% oxygen level. A nurse came in frantically and said, we need to intubate him right now. I mean, if he's not responding to this, we can't, we got to put him in a medically induced coma and put him in a ventilator. So they put me in a coma, and they put a ventilator in. And when they first put the ventilator on, one of the technicians had not put a certain setting on he had put assisted control on, which is a setting in which a volume of oxygen is given every 6 seconds. And it doesn't observe how you're breathing. It just gives it directly every 6 seconds. But for you to go into that setting, you have to be completely sedated. And I wasn't completely sedated. So my breathing was fighting the oxygen load being delivered. And that clash created a pneumothorax in my right lung. So I had a collapsed right lung as well. So they gave me 2 chest tubes. And the moment I had 2 collapsed lungs, I became a priority for maybe a lung transplant right then. So I wasn't responding well. Next slide. So I wasn't responding well at all. They had to keep my eyes shut because my eyes were staying open in the coma and they were drying out. And that was horrible. And so I was on the ventilator, and at this time my lips were beginning to turn blue because of lack of oxygen. And they had put me in a position called proning, which Dr. Crotty can explain as well, where they put you on your stomach to get rid of. First of all, I think it improves the breathing, and also it's for them to take out some of the mucus or some of the blockage. And in that position, I've been under so much pressure that my eyes were beginning to pop out as well. They were extremely swollen, and because of that position, the pressure had created a pressure in my left eye. Next slide. Perfect. Yeah. So then I wasn't responding well. So one day, a doctor named Dr. Goltz, and Dr. Crotty, I'm sure, knows about Dr. Goltz, Eugene Goltz. He came into the room and he had heard about me in the lung transplant meetings. Because every day or so they have a meeting, and the surgeons come in. They're like they look at all the cases of the different people that need a transplant. And I had been brought up, and I was 19 years old. I was healthy. I had no history of any chronic illness, and they were talking about giving me a lung transplant. And many people don't know this, but when you get a lung transplant, you only have 5 to 7 years really before you either need another lung transplant or you're not going to live really. Your quality of living is going to be horrible. You'll probably die. And you have to get this immunosuppression as well in order for your body not to reject the organ. Now, there was 2 factions at the time. Some people wanted me to get a lung transplant because they really thought that was my only way out. And they would come to my parents and say, well, there's some cases of people with lung transplant living up to 14 years. And my parents were like, what? He's 19 years old. We don't want our kid to live until he's like 33. Like, we want him to have the best chance. So they held off on that, and for a good thing. And one day Dr. Goltz comes in and he's like, I heard about your son. And my dad's like, yep. And he's like, have you ever heard of ECMO? And my dad's like, I have heard of it. He's like, well, I think this could help him. And within 5 minutes of that conversation taking place, maybe 20 minutes later, I was in the surgery room receiving this procedure. So, and I have a great deal of thanks and praise for Dr. Goltz, because what he did was probably one of the most instrumental moves in my survival was me going on ECMO. It made a major difference. And so what they did was they take this machine is a pump with an oxygenator, and those tubes run to the cannulas of your heart. And I have a scar here still. And the tubes run to your heart, and it pumps oxygenated blood through your body. And this is life support. This is probably the most extreme. Only the sickest people in the whole country have to go on this machine. But I was put on this machine, and I was on it for 8 days. And basically I was on this machine, and next slide. And this machine basically delivered oxygen for me. So it was a great thing because I actually didn't really even have to breathe. Like I could have held my breath for 8 days and probably survive, which is an interesting thing about technology, how it has advanced and how we can save people that like maybe 40 years ago wouldn't be able to be saved. Next slide. So at that time, I was being brought out of the coma, and I told my dad, and I couldn't talk because I had a ventilator in my mouth. So I told my dad, I want to live. And he's like, well, son, I think you're going to make it, but you have a lot of work ahead of you. And one of the first things that I had to do was walk while on ECMO. Because I'd been sedentary for so long, I needed blood to circulate through my organs again. And that's a major thing. A couple things that occur when you're in a coma is that, first of all, within the first week of being in a medically induced coma, you lose about half of your strength. So I lost about half of my strength at that time. And the next thing that begins to happen is because of the fact that you're being pumped full of all these drugs and your body's under stress and you're sedentary, because of the lack of blood flow, your sometimes organs begin to fail. And one of the things that they were seeing was that the enzymes and the toxicity in my liver and my liver, was beginning to become kind of out of control. And so they said that we need to get him walking so that we can get those back to some normal level. So I began walking, and next slide. And so I began walking, and I actually hold the record at UCSD for the longest walk on ECMO, which is 130 feet. And the previous record was I believe, I'm not quite sure what it was, but it was, I walked the longest, actually in my case report, they wrote that because they did a British Medicine Journal case report on me. And in that, they said that this person was able to walk the longest that anybody has at UCSD. And it was because in high school, I was an athlete. So I had a fighting spirit, and I wasn't going to take no for an answer. And I was going to walk not as far as I wanted to, but as far as physically and mentally, my body would possibly take me. So, and that was one of the reasons why I was able to survive this, given that there was a pretty good chance I could have died throughout all of this, to be honest, because I believe about 40% of the people that go on ECMO die. And ARDS, which is what I was diagnosed with, which was mentioned by Dr. Crotty previously, called acute respiratory distress syndrome. I believe ARDS has like a 50% mortality rate as well. So really, I mean, if you add up all the different problems that I had, thanks to the great medical aid and the great doctors at UCSD, I was able to survive, and because of my own will. But at the same time, a lot of things could have gone wrong. And I'm thank God when I woke up from having lack of oxygen, I wasn't brain dead. Thank God I'm able to function. That's another thing, Next slide. So this is my dad, and they took the ventilator out, and that was really awesome for me that they took the ventilator out, because honestly, I was starting to lose my mind. A lot of people don't know this, but the ICU is a horrible place for relaxation. And the reason why is because, they're checking your blood pressure every 5 seconds. This thing is blowing up on your arm to check your blood pressure. They're getting needles stuck inside you all the time. There's machines going off all the time. There's lights, there's beeping from other rooms, and you're in a coma. So you're probably hallucinating, and you probably think that the nurses are trying to kill you, which is something that I did think for the first few days. And it's not unheard of. It's not like I was crazy. It was because that's a common theme among people that are in a coma, is that they legitimately think that the nurses are trying to kill them. And I remember a few of the nurses were very upset. They were really offended. Actually, one of them, I never forget this, and I couldn't believe this was happening to me. One of them said no, she actually punished me. I said, please don't change my dose of my medicine, because I thought she was trying to kill me. And I kept writing it on the whiteboard to remind her, and she got upset. And she wrote on the board, no TV, no music. And I had a TV in my room, and I couldn't believe it, because first of all, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't give a hell about the TV. I couldn't even see the TV. My eyes are kind of weak. So for me, the TV was a headache. So thank God. So anyhow, next slide. So I'm finally feeling a little bit better. And I believe that this nurse was combing my hair, and it was good because the nurses at UCSD finally made me feel like I was a human again, which is one of the most important things about being a nurse, is that when somebody's in that sort of position, their body is basically treated like, to some extent, as if it's like, they don't care about your feelings because they're trying to save you. So you might not feel like a human for a period, but when one of the most important things nurses do is they make you feel like a human again. And that's part of rehabilitation. Next slide. So yeah, so I lost about 50 pounds in about 2 weeks. And so I hadn't had any water and I hadn't had any food. And so they had fed me through like the back of my throat, which was good, into my stomach. But that was like 1,000 calories a day. And I honestly, my metabolism, I probably burn about 3,000 a day. So really, I mean, I was just deficit the whole time. And that was the first shower I took. And I'll tell you what, that was really, really good. I hadn't showered in 2 weeks. That's the longest I haven't showered. Next slide. So then I ate my first meal. I was actually really scared to eat the first meal because my throat muscles were compromised due to the ventilator. So it was kind of like I didn't want to choke on any of the foods. So I really, really took it so slow, and I didn't finish the meal. Next slide. So this was me in high school. I was a track star. I ran 100 meter, 200 meter, the hurdles, the shot put, and the long jump. And then next slide. This was me after I got sick. The far left, the two on the left are right after. So in about 2 weeks, I lost probably 50 pounds of muscle, which is maybe like 40 pounds of muscle and like 5 or 10 pounds of fat, which is more realistic. And it was just crazy because when I looked in the mirror, because of all the drugs they'd given me, I looked, my pupils were so dilated, I felt like I was a heroin addict. And I know that's kind of funny, but that's how I looked and felt like I wasn't myself. But of course, within probably 2 weeks, the picture that's second from the right was about 2 or 3 weeks after, and then about a month after is the picture on the right. Next slide. And then now this was about 3 or 4 months ago. So then I gained at a miraculous speed. I gained a lot of muscle, and I did that by eating a lot of food, eating very healthy. And this also ties into Mr. Guzman, what he was saying earlier about New Year's, having new resolutions, and not only trying to quit vaping, but also leading a healthier life. And that starts with diet and exercise and good sleep. And often for these young kids that vape, exercise can take the place of these vices that they have. It's all about them just finding it within themselves to live a healthier life. Next slide. So, this is the article that they wrote about me in the New York Times, and I have everything to thank Dr. Crotty for that. She's an amazing person. She's given me a number of platforms to speak about what I went through. And I think that it's symbiotic. I think we both help each other in terms of presentation because she's the scientific side and I'm the more human, personal side. But I was in this article and they basically asked me everything that I went through, and this was probably the farthest that my story has ever reached. However, I do hope that my story reaches more people and affects more young people's lives, because I don't think this vaping problem is something that's going to go away all that easily. So thank you for listening to my story, and I hope that you learned something or that it gave you a better view into what this experience was like, and hopefully your kids, you're able to tell your kids about this as well.
Thank you, Janan. Let's give Janan a round of applause. Thank you so much, Janan, for sharing your story with us today. Your story will touch so many people and help save lives. So thank you so much. And now we are going into the Q&A session for Janan. Does anyone have any questions for Janan today?
1, 8, 1.
Janan, are you back to full weight?
Yep. I mean, honestly, I'm going to be real with you. I think I've gained a little bit of weight because of Corona. I'm a little too heavy. I think I should be 215 pounds, but I'm 230 right now. But it's okay.
I think that's one thing that you really convey is that, like, before this happened, you were very focused on fitness and, taking care of yourself, and this thing sort of came in and sort of took over. And it's nice to come back to that viewpoint.
So you brought up, one of the things that you brought up was that by the time your dad actually caught on to anything going on, you were almost at the on the other side of the hill. You had already, you weren't in the danger zone. So there's no odor. So I guess my question would be to any parent that's out there is, what are some of the signs that parents should be looking for right now before it gets to that stage of my kid's awake at 4 o'clock in the morning and they're hacking like crazy?
So I'm not an advocate for kids smoking weed, but the thing is that I realize as a young person, and I think parents should realize, is that whether you want your kids to smoke weed or you don't want them to, a lot of the times they're going to do whatever the hell they want to do. And it's better to just tell them, it's better to just be okay with certain things in order to avert things that are far worse. And I know that Dr. Crotty said, well, people that smoke weed and smoke cigarettes and vape are more likely to do cocaine. And I know that there's this, everybody says, well, cannabis is the gateway drug. Well, whether it's a gateway drug or not, it plays a huge role in California. I mean, dispensaries are everywhere now. And that's why I think that what I usually would tell a parent is the same thing that Dr. Crotty tells some other people that are at these presentations. And that is that if you want to get high and you want to smoke weed, either smoke actual flower, actual cannabis, or take edibles, because that won't cause you to, if you're looking after that, if you want that sort of sensation that cannabis gives you, don't vape it. The end of story. And that's, if I was a parent and I saw that my kid was smoking weed, and it's easy to tell, you look at their pupils, you can tell if their eyes are red, if they're acting stupid, but you tell them, you say, listen, son, I don't like you smoking, and I understand that that's not a good thing, and I don't want you vaping either. But I was reading these articles and it said that the safest way is to eat an edible. And I know that this is something difficult to tell parents, because what parent is going to tell their kid, son, go have an edible? Nobody's going to say that. But, at the end of the day, you gotta hedge your bets in the right direction. And you win some, you lose some. And you can't have it all. If my dad had said, son, I know you're smoking joints in your balcony. I get it. I was young once and I used to smoke cannabis here and there. Just try to keep it in check. Don't do it too often. And, hey, I read about those vape cannabis things. Stay away from those. If I smell it every once in a while, I'm okay with it, but don't vape it. If he'd said that, maybe it would have been a completely ballgame. Maybe it would have been a different story. I wouldn't be here telling you how I almost died.
I have to thank Loralee for putting the talkaboutVaping.org link in the chat box, because I think that's what I've heard over and over and over again, is that having open conversations is probably the best thing. That's the way to go for parenting. And I think, Janan, how you've mentioned, you can't just tell a kid not to do something, because they're very likely to do the opposite of that. So really just trying to have an open atmosphere and allowing them to share that information. That seems to be what everybody's recommending. But I think that looks different for each family about how you get your child to open up about stuff like that.
Yeah.
Right. So that link I put in there, talkaboutVaping.org, that's the American Lung Association Guide for Adults and Parents, to begin those conversations. And it has facts. It talks about some of the signs of use. Some of the things on there are, the presence of, unfamiliar technology, like you were saying, the flash drives, faint, sweet, or fruity scents, behavioral and mood changes, increased irritability or restlessness, cutting back on caffeine, increased thirst, nosebleeds. And then it goes also into what do some of these devices look like, some Q&A, and just some approaches to take in starting a blog. So please take advantage of that resource, talkaboutvaping.org.
If you guys are okay with it, please let Pierra know and give her or I'm sure she has your point of contact information. We'll share that with Amy and Jessica, and we'll, along with the video recording that we will post, we can also, if you're open to it, share your contact information, and then and that way when our partners, our membership starts looking at it later on and they want to contact you directly about something, they'd have the capability to do so.
And also in the chat box, I put in Janan's New York Times article in the chat box. So if you have some spare time, it's a great read. Please take a look at it, and you'll learn a lot from his article. Any more questions for Janan before we close out? If not,
I had a question. This is Lilia. Sorry.
Hi, Lilia.
Thank you.
That's
Hey,
okay.
how's it going? Thank you so much for sharing your story, Janan, and obviously, Dr. Crotty, thank you so much for sharing the experiences. I had a quick question. I was very curious to know. In the chat box, it was placed that most patients that experience acute respiratory distress are placed in a prone position, which reminds me a lot how either massage therapists and or sports medicine therapy people place certain individuals in a prone position to work with back muscles. I'm curious to know how does it alleviate the respiratory distress for any youth that are experiencing technical difficulties with breathing, and how does it improve when they go into before they go into intubation, obviously.
So actually, I think the ETS COVID Critical Care Training Forum, and we just had a session last night. Since we're over a year into this pandemic, we wanted to compare notes across the world to see, is our treatment of acute lung injury and COVID, where are we now? Are we doing the right things? And one of the main foci has been on proning. But proning has been around for about 20 years, but the strongest data has really come out in the last 8 years. And it has been a tool that we've used a lot, not only as in Janan's position with his type of lung injury, but again, in COVID-19. We have some of the world's best physiologists who look at this. So it's a great question, first of all. So hammer on the nail right there. And people think that it has several different positive effects. But to clarify one piece, when we put somebody in the prone position, we keep them there for hours. So it's not really proning them for 30 minutes or so. It's really, you put them in the prone position and you see the improvement happen over several hours. And part of it is just straight up physiology, that when you're on your back, a lot of your lung tissue, so more like 70% of your lung tissue is dependent, meaning that it has the heart laying on top of it and your abdominal organs are pushing up and sort of collapsing them. But when you're on your belly, because they're along your spine, they have more room, they're not getting crushed. And so that's one of the biggest reasons that we think that it helps, is just that the lungs, it takes some of the pressure off of the lungs that are put on it from our bodies. And because they're just on the verge of failure, they have so much injury in there, they need every little bit that you can help them with. So that's sort of one concept of why the proning works. And we actually prone people for about 16 to 18 hours every day. And then we have them on their back for 6 hours, and then we do it again. And doing it over and over and over again while somebody's lungs are hurt is what seems to really help the most, instead of just little bits. But we actually ask people to self-prone for as much as possible, because that can help avoid having to put the breathing tube in. And it can be really hard for somebody to lay on their stomach for, you know, more than 30 minutes. Like that's our main thing that we're dealing with, is giving people like muscle relaxants and pain meds, because everything starts to hurt when you try and lay on your stomach for that long. So it's fascinating. There's lots of work in that area, but I'm just glad that that tool helps us get people through.
Doctor, I have a quick question. My question is that why were my eyes like under so much pressure in that position?
So it's the liquid. So the liquid can build up in the tissues here. So just like when you're flat and your whole body's inflamed, so you're having some leakage of fluid out of your vessels. But when you're on your front, you know, your face is just so delicate. And so when you build up fluid in this area, it's just so much more apparent and obvious. And so it's just one of those things. And sometimes, yeah, we have to stop proning people when they have just too much edema in their face.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Crotty-Alexander, and thank you, Lilia, for your question. Are there any more questions before we close today? I also put back in the link for our survey. If you guys can please kindly fill out the survey for today's education series webinar. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you again, Dr. Crotty-Alexander and Janan, for being our guest speakers for today's webinar series.
Thanks.
Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Have a great day. Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
You too, Janan.